On the night of August 14, 1947, India became free. After 200 years of British colonization, the subcontinent finally reclaimed its independence. It should have been the greatest moment in Indian history. Instead, it became one of the bloodiest nights the world has ever seen. Because Britain did not simply leave India when they left. They divided it. In 6 weeks, a British lawyer named Cyril Radcliffe, a man who had never visited India, who knew nothing of its languages, its communities, or its centuries of coexistence, drew a line through the heart of the subcontinent. That line became the border between India and Pakistan. And everything it cut through, villages, farms, families, communities that had lived together for centuries, was torn apart overnight. What followed was the largest forced migration in human history. 15 million people displaced, up to 2 million dead, not killed by war, not killed by famine, killed by a line drawn in 6 weeks by a man who had never set foot in the country he was dividing. In June 1947, the British government made a decision that would change the course of history. They appointed a lawyer named Cyril Radcliffe to draw the borders of the newly independent nations of India and Pakistan. Radcliffe was a distinguished lawyer. He was intelligent and professional. He had never been to India. He was given 6 weeks to divide a subcontinent of 400 million people along religious lines, separating Muslim-majority areas into Pakistan and Hindu and Sikh-majority areas into India. 6 weeks. To redraw a civilization that had existed for 5,000 years. Radcliffe worked from maps and census data in a New Delhi office. He consulted with advisors from both sides who disagreed on almost everything. When he finished, the Radcliffe line cut through the Punjab in the west and Bengal in the east, 2 of the most densely populated and culturally rich regions of the subcontinent. It cut through villages whose residents had lived as neighbors for generations. It cut through farms whose owners suddenly found their fields in a different country. It cut through families, leaving some members in India and others in Pakistan overnight. The borders were announced on August 17th, 2 days after independence had already been declared. For 2 days, people celebrated freedom without knowing which country they were celebrating it in. When the borders were announced, the reaction was immediate and catastrophic. Muslims in India began moving west toward Pakistan. Hindus and Sikhs in Pakistan began moving east toward India. 15 million people, moving in opposite directions, through the same roads, through the same train stations. The British had anticipated some population movement. They had not anticipated this scale of human desperation. There were not enough trains. There were not enough roads. There were not enough soldiers to maintain order. People walked. Families carried everything they owned on their backs and walked hundreds of kilometers in the summer heat toward a country that did not yet fully exist. Columns of refugees stretched for miles in both directions, the largest human migration ever recorded in history up to that point. And as they moved, the violence began. What happened along the roads and railways of Punjab and Bengal in August and September of 1947 is almost impossible to describe. Communities that had lived in peace for generations turned on each other with a ferocity that shocked even seasoned observers of human conflict. Entire villages were massacred. Trains carrying refugees arrived at their destinations filled with corpses. Every passenger killed before the train crossed the border. Women were targeted deliberately, used as instruments of communal violence in ways that historians have documented, but that remain almost impossible to read about directly. The Indian and Pakistani governments, both newly formed and overwhelmed, struggled to maintain order along a border that was only days old and thousands of kilometers long. The British forces who remained in the region during the transition were largely withdrawn before the full scale of the violence became apparent. Estimates of the death toll vary. The most conservative estimates place it at 200,000. Most historians believe the true number was between 500,000 and 2 million people. In 6 to 8 weeks, more people killed than in many wars that lasted years. All of it traceable to a single decision. to divide a civilization in 6 weeks with a line drawn by a man who had never seen it. The question that historians have debated for decades is this: did Britain know what would happen? The evidence suggests they did. Internal British government documents declassified in the decades since show that senior officials were warned repeatedly. Military commanders on the ground warned London that 6 weeks was nowhere near enough time to organize a safe transition for the populations that would need to move. Community leaders from Punjab warned the British administration that drawing lines through mixed communities would trigger exactly the kind of violence that followed. The warnings were received. The timeline was not changed. Why? The most commonly cited explanation is that Britain was exhausted by the Second World War, financially depleted, and politically committed to leaving India as quickly as possible. The new Labour government in London wanted the India problem resolved before the next election. A slower, more carefully managed partition that might have prevented much of the killing would have taken longer. Britain chose speed over safety, and the people of Punjab and Bengal paid for that choice with their lives. Cyril Radcliffe himself never spoke publicly about the partition in any detail for the rest of his life. He burned all his papers related to the Boundary Commission before leaving India. He refused all interviews on the subject. He never returned to India. He died in 1977, having never publicly accounted for the consequences of the line he drew in 6 weeks. 75 years later, the partition of India remains the defining trauma of the subcontinent. The border that Radcliffe drew in 6 weeks has been the source of 3 major wars between India and Pakistan in 1947, 1965, and 1971. It has been the context for dozens of smaller conflicts, terrorist attacks, and diplomatic crises that continue to shape the politics of South Asia today. The disputed territory of Kashmir, cut through by the partition line in a way that satisfied neither side, remains one of the most militarized borders on Earth. The families divided by the partition have spent generations separated from each other by a border they never voted for, never agreed to, and never fully accepted. There are people alive today whose grandparents were born in cities they can never visit because those cities are now in a different country. Britain has never formally apologized for the partition. It has never acknowledged that the 6-week timeline was a choice that cost lives. The line that a British lawyer drew in 6 weeks in a New Delhi office is still there. It still divides families. It still triggers conflicts. It still shapes the lives of 1.7 billion people across India and Pakistan every single day. August 14th and 15th, 1947. 2 nations celebrated independence on consecutive nights. And between those 2 celebrations, in the weeks that followed, up to 2 million people died for a line drawn in 6 weeks by a man who had never walked the land he divided. History remembers the independence, the fireworks, the flags, Nehru's speech about a tryst with destiny. It remembers the freedom. What it remembers less clearly, what is taught less often, discussed less frequently, acknowledged less honestly, is the price that was paid for it. Not by Britain, by India, by Pakistan, by the 15 million people who walked across a line they had no part in drawing, by the families who never found each other again. This is not ancient history. The grandchildren of partition are alive today. The wounds are alive today. The consequences are alive today. India's freedom was real. It was hard-won, and it was fully deserved. But it came at a cost that Britain imposed and India paid. And that cost has never been fully reckoned with. This is India Untold. Subscribe, because this story is far from over.